The Nevada sun was a hammer, beating down on the vast expanse of Nellis Air Force Base. It baked the asphalt of the flight line until the air shimmered, making the rows of F-16 Fighting Falcons look like gray ghosts in the heat. For Captain Eva Rostova, call sign Valkyrie, this place was both a dream and a cage. It was the pinnacle of a fighter pilot's career, the home of the best of the best. But for her it felt more like a fortress, and she was on the outside, looking in. Eva stood by her jet, the number 892035 stenciled on its tail, and ran a gloved hand along the fuselage. She knew every inch of this machine, every rivet and wire. She could feel its power humming even in silence, a sleeping giant ready to tear a hole in the sky. Flying was the only time she felt truly free, the only time the world made perfect sense. Up there, at 30,000 feet with the sky a deep, endless blue above and the world a patchwork quilt below, there was no judgment, there was only the machine, the mission, and her skill. Down here, on the ground, skill wasn't always enough. Well, look what we have here. A voice drawled behind her. If it isn't our very own Queen of the Skies, gracing us with her presence. Eva didn't need to turn around. She knew that voice. It was Major Rick Thompson, call sign Jester. He was tall, with a movie star smile and a swagger that seemed to own the very ground he walked on. He was the squadron's golden boy, the one everyone pointed to as the future of the Air Force, who was also the main reason Ava's dream felt like a cage. She turned slowly, her face a neutral mask. Major, something I can help you with. Jester leaned against the wing of his own jet, parked next to hers. Two of his cronies, Captains Miller and Davis, flanked him like bookends. They were all grinning, that same smug, dismissive grin Eva had come to despise. Just admiring the view, Valkyrie, Jester said, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. You know, we were just taking bets in the briefing room. The over-under on how many training rules you'd bend today. I took the over, by the way. Always ambitious, our Valkyrie, Miller chuckled. She doesn't bend rules, Jester, she just has her own interpretation of them. It's a female perspective on aerial combat. The words were meant to sting, and they did. It was the same old song. In their eyes, she wasn't just a pilot, she was a female pilot, an anomaly, a box that had to be ticked for the sake of diversity. Every success she had was treated as a fluke, every mistake as proof that she didn't belong. She had graduated top of her class at the academy, aced every test, and outflown nearly every pilot in training. But here, in the real world of an operational squadron, none of that seemed to matter as much as the simple fact that she wasn't one of them. Dotova kept her voice steady, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. The only thing I'm focused on, Major, is the mission objective. Maybe you should try it sometime. Jester's smile tightened. He pushed himself off the wing and took a step closer, invading her personal space. He lowered his voice, the fake charm replaced by a cold edge. Listen, Rust, you might have the brass fooled, but you don't have us fooled. You got here because of a quota. You stay here because they're afraid of the paperwork it would take to get rid of you. But don't you ever forget that when we're up there, you're a liability. This is a man's world, you're just visiting. He tapped the side of her helmet, a gesture that was both condescending and threatening. Then he turned and walked away, his lackeys trailing in his wake, laughing amongst themselves. Eva stood frozen for a moment, her fists clenched so tight her knuckles were white. The desert heat felt cold. She wanted to scream, to throw her helmet at the back of his arrogant head, but she couldn't. That was what they wanted. They wanted her to be emotional, to be irrational. They wanted her to prove them right. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she forced her hands to relax. She looked at her reflection in the polished canopy of her jet. The woman staring back at her looked tired. The fire in her eyes, the one that had driven her to this point, was banked low, struggling for air. Her crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant named Frank, walked up, holding a wrench. He had seen the whole exchange. Frank was old school, a man of few words, but he was one of the few people on the base who treated her with simple, straightforward respect. Don't let them get to you, Captain, he said, his voice a low rumble. Their egos write checks, their skills can't cash. You just fly your plane. Thanks, Frank, Eva said, the words coming out quieter than she intended. I finished the diagnostics on that new sensor pod, he said, changing the subject. Everything's green. It's supposed to give you a much clearer picture of the battle space. State-of-the-art stuff. Good, Eva nodded, trying to push Jester's words from her mind and focus on the task at hand. Let's hope it works as advertised. Today's training exercise was a complex one. a simulated strike on a heavily defended enemy position. Eva was flying, Red Air, playing the part of the enemy, tasked with defending the target. Jester was leading Blue Air, the strike package. It was a classic matchup, a high-stakes game of chess in the sky. But for Eva it felt like more than a game. It was another test, another chance for Jester to make her look bad. An hour later, she was strapped into her cockpit, the canopy sealed, the roar of the jet engine a familiar comfort. As she taxied onto the runway, she went through her pre-flight checks, her mind a focused machine. The insults, the anger, the frustration, she packed it all away into a small, dark box in the back of her mind. You couldn't fly with that kind of baggage. It would get you killed. Valkyrie, you are cleared for takeoff. The tower controller's voice crackled in her ears. She pushed the throttle forward, and the F-16 leaped ahead, pressing her back into her seat. The ground fell away, and the world opened up. The familiar weightlessness, the sense of absolute freedom, washed over her. This was her sanctuary. The training area was a massive empty stretch of desert, dotted with canyons and mesas. Her mission was to use the terrain to her advantage, to hide, and to strike at Jester's formation when they were most vulnerable. The new sensor pod Frank had mentioned was supposed to give her an edge, allowing her to see them before they saw her. She flew low, a silver dart skimming over the brown earth. Her eyes scanned the horizon, her fingers dancing over the controls on her throttle and stick. Valkyrie, what's your status? Her wingman, a young pilot named Green, asked over the radio. I'm in the weeds, just south of the target area. Staying off the radar, she replied. You hold your position and wait for my signal. She checked her new sensor display. It was supposed to be a god's eye view, a clear map of all electronic signals in the area, but it looked fuzzy. Data streams were flickering in and out. Strange anomalies, ghost signals, appeared and disappeared. It was like trying to read a map through a waterfall. Control Valkyrie, my sensor pod is acting up. I'm getting corrupted data. Roger Valkyrie, a calm voice from the command center, replied. We're seeing some atmospheric interference on our end. It should clear up. Eva frowned. It didn't feel like atmospheric interference. It felt like a system malfunction. But she had to work with what she had. She tried to filter out the noise, focusing on the signals that seemed most stable. According to the flickering display, Jester's four-ship formation was approaching from the north, flying at a medium altitude, just as expected. They were predictable, too predictable. A nagging feeling, a pilot's intuition, tickled the back of her neck. Something was wrong. Jester was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. This felt too easy. She decided to trust her gut over the faulty equipment. Green, I'm changing the plan, she said into her mic. I'm going to sweep west. Something doesn't feel right about this northern approach. Copy, Valkyrie, Green responded, his voice betraying a hint of confusion. As Eva banked her jet hard to the west, her main radar screen suddenly lit up. 2 contacts, flying fast and low, coming straight at her from the direction she had just turned toward. They had been hiding in a canyon, using the terrain to mask their approach. If she had stayed put, they would have been on top of her before. She knew what hit her, that it was a classic flanking maneuver. Jester had sent 2 of his pilots on a decoy run from the north, while he and his wingman snuck in from the west. Her faulty sensor pod had only shown her the decoys. It had completely missed the real threat. Engaged the bandits. 5 miles nose on, she yelled into the radio, her training taking over. She pulled back on the stick, climbing hard to gain an energy advantage. The sky, which had been empty moments before, was now a swirling chaos of motion. The 2 blue air jets were on her, their virtual missiles locking on. Eva broke hard, pulling G's that made her vision tunnel. Her wingman, Green, was scrambling to catch up, but he was too far out of position. She was alone, fighting 2-on-1. She could hear Jester's voice on the comms, cool and triumphant. Looks like Valkyrie fell for the bait. Move in for the kill. Eva gritted her teeth. She twisted and turned, her F-16 dancing on the edge of its performance envelope. She managed to evade the first simulated missile shot, but the second one was perfect. A loud tone shrieked in her cockpit, signaling a direct hit. Valkyrie is hit. I'm out of the fight, she said, her voice flat, professional, betraying none of the fury and humiliation boiling inside her. Better luck next time, Captain. Jester's voice oozed with false sympathy. Maybe stick to the basics before you try getting creative. The rest of the exercise was a formality. With Eva out of the picture, Jester's team easily destroyed the target. Back on the ground, the debriefing was brutal. The flight data recorder seemed to confirm Jester's version of events. It showed Eva abandoning her defensive position and flying directly into a trap, ignoring the clear data from her sensor pod. The squadron commander, Colonel Hayes, a man who valued textbook perfection above all else, looked at her with undisguised disappointment. Captain Rostova, your performance today was not just subpar, it was reckless, he said, his voice echoing in the silent briefing room. You were given a state-of-the-art piece of equipment to provide you with superior situational awareness. Instead, you chose to ignore it and fly on a hunch. Your wingman was left exposed, and you were shot down in the first engagement. That is unacceptable. Sir, Eva began, trying to keep her voice even. With all due respect, the sensor pod was malfunctioning. It was feeding me ghost signals and completely missed the primary threat. Jester, standing at the back of the room, scoffed loudly enough for everyone to hear. A bad workman blames her tools, Colonel. Colonel Hayes shot Jester a warning glance, but then turned his attention back to Eva. The post-flight diagnostics on your pod show no malfunctions. Captain, none. The data it recorded matches what we saw on our screens. It showed the northern threat exactly where it was. Eva felt the floor drop out from under her. No malfunctions, that was impossible. She knew what she had seen. The flickering screen, the ghost signals. It was real unless the malfunction itself was designed not to be found. Unless the data it recorded was faked. Her eyes shot to Jester. He was looking at his feet, but she could see the faintest smirk on his lips. It was him. He had to have done something. But how? And how could she prove it? She had nothing but her word, and her word, she was quickly learning, wasn't worth much around here. I know what I saw, sir, she said, her voice pleading now. What I see, the colonel said, his voice like stone, is a pilot who is not ready for the responsibilities of her position. You're grounded, Captain, effective immediately. You'll be on desk duty pending a full review of your flight status. We can't afford to have liabilities in the air. The word hit her like a physical blow. Liability, the exact same word Jester had used. The debriefing was over. The other pilots filed out, some giving her sympathetic looks, others avoiding her eyes completely. Jester walked past her, pausing for just a second. Desk duty suits you, he whispered, his voice dripping with venom. Less chance of you getting someone killed. Eva stood alone in the empty room, the silence pressing in on her. She had been beaten, not in the sky, not by a better pilot, but on the ground, by whispers and lies. She had been sabotaged, and she had no way to fight back. Her career, everything she had worked for, was hanging by a thread, and the man who was cutting it was being hailed as a hero. The cage had just gotten a whole lot smaller. The next 2 weeks were the longest of Ava's life. The cockpit, her sanctuary, was replaced by a cramped, windowless office. The roar of a jet engine was replaced by the monotonous hum of a computer. Instead of a flight helmet, she wore a headset, pushing papers and coordinating supply schedules. She was a pilot, a warrior trained to command a multi-million-dollar piece of machinery at twice the speed of sound, and she was spending her days arguing with logistics sergeants over pallets of MREs. It was a special kind of hell, designed to be both boring and humiliating. The review of her flight status was a slow, grinding process. It felt less like an investigation and more like a formality, a slow march toward the inevitable end of her career. Jester and his crew treated her like a ghost, walking past her in the hallways as if she didn't exist. The few friends she had, like Captain Mike Chen, callsign Gadget, tried to be supportive, but there was little they could do. Gadget was an electronics warfare officer, a genius with anything that had a circuit board. He was quiet and thoughtful, the polar opposite of Jester's boisterous arrogance. He and Eva had come up through training together, and he was one of the few who had never doubted her skills. I believe you, Eva, he said one evening, as they sat in the corner of the dreary base cantina. That sensor pod story stinks. Jester's been gunning for you since you got here. Believing me and proving it are two different things, Mike, Eva said, stirring her coffee. The diagnostics came back clean. Frank even ran them again for me. Off the record, nothing. It's like the malfunction never happened. Maybe that's the point, Gadget mused, tapping his fingers on the table. The most elegant hacks are the ones that clean up after themselves. If someone knew the system inside and out, they could introduce a subtle error into the data stream, something that would only manifest under specific conditions, then have the program erase the evidence of the error from the internal logs. It would be incredibly difficult, but not impossible. Someone like Jester, Eva asked. Gadget shrugged. He's not smart enough to write the code himself, but he knows people. He's well connected. All he'd need is the how-to and 5 minutes. Alone with the pod's maintenance port, Ava's heart sank. It all made a terrible kind of sense. A ghost in the machine, sent to haunt her and then vanish without a trace. It was the perfect crime. It doesn't matter, she said, her voice heavy with resignation. It's my word against his, and he's the golden boy. I'm already done. Just as the last of her hope was beginning to fade, the world shifted. Tensions had been simmering for months with a rogue nation overseas, a country run by a militaristic dictator with a history of aggression. Suddenly, the simmering boiled over. Intelligence reports, stark and alarming, flashed across secure networks. The rogue state had made a move, crossing a border and seizing a disputed territory rich in oil. The atmosphere at Nellis changed overnight. The lazy piece of training was gone, replaced by a tense, focused energy. The squadron was put on high alert. A mission was coming, a real one. The mission briefing was held in the main auditorium, the vault, a secure, soundproof room deep in the heart of the base. Colonel Hayes stood at the podium, his face grim. A satellite image of a rugged, mountainous region was projected on the screen behind him. "All right, listen up," he began, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of anticipation. "At 0400 tomorrow, we are sending a 4-ship reconnaissance package deep into hostile airspace. Your primary objective is to get eyes on a suspected surface-to-air missile, or SAM site located here," he said, pointing to a red circle on the map. "Intel believes they're setting up a new generation of long-range missiles, the kind that could threaten our assets throughout the region. We need to confirm the site's location and capabilities before we can plan a strike." He paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. This wasn't a game. There would be no simulated missile hits, no resets. "This is a high-risk mission," he continued. "The area is crawling with enemy fighters, and their early warning radar coverage is formidable. We need to go in low, fast, and quiet. Major Thompson, you'll be leading the mission. You'll have Miller and Davis on your wings." Jester nodded, a look of grim importance on his face. This was his moment, the chance to prove his mettle in real combat. "Ben," Colonel Hayes said something that made everyone in the room turn their heads. "Your 4th pilot will be Captain Chen, flying the EA-18G Growler. His job will be electronic warfare, jamming their radar to clear a path for the strike package, and flying as his backseater, his EWO, will be Captain Rostova." A stunned silence fell over the room. Eva felt her own heart stopped. Backseater. She was a pilot, an F-16 pilot. The backseat of a Growler was for electronics warfare officers, not pilots. It was a non-flying role. Jester was the first to speak, his voice laced with disbelief. "Colonel, with all due respect, Rostova is grounded." "I'm aware of her status," Major Hayes said, his eyes fixed on Eva. "However, she has more hours logged on the new generation jamming suite than any other EWO on this base, from her time in test and evaluation. Captain Chen specifically requested her. He feels her expertise is critical to the success of this mission, and on a mission this vital. I'm not leaving our best assets on the bench." Eva looked over at Gadget, who gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. He had done this. He had found a way to get her back in the air, even if it was in the back seat. It was a lifeline, a thin, frayed rope, but it was something. "I won't let you down, sir," Eva said, her voice clear and steady. Kay's just grunted. "See that you don't. You're a guest in that cockpit, Captain. You listen to Captain Chen, and you do your job, nothing more. Is that understood?" "Crystal clear, sir," she replied. The flight prep was tense. Jester and his team pointedly ignored her, huddling together and speaking in low murmurs. They saw her as a liability, a piece of baggage being forced upon them. Eva didn't care. She focused on the mission, going over the jamming protocols with Gadget, memorizing the enemy's radar frequencies, planning their electronic attack down to the second. In the pre-dawn darkness, they walked to their planes. The Growler, a 2-seat variant of the FA-18 Super Hornet, was laden with jamming pods under its wings. It was a different beast from her F-16, bigger and built not for dogfighting, but for fighting a war of electrons and radio waves. Strapped into the back seat, Eva felt a strange mix of emotions. She was grateful to be flying again, but the feeling of being a passenger was alien to her. The controls were in front of Gadget. Her job was to manage the complex suite of electronics in the back. "You ready for this?" Gadget's voice came through the intercom.com as ever. "Born ready," she replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Just like old times," he said. "You handle the noise, I'll handle the driving." They took off into the dark sky, a quartet of gray shapes against the fading stars. They flew in tight formation, silent and low, streaking across the desert toward the border for 2 hours. The flight was smooth. They refueled from an airborne tanker and pushed on, the sun rising behind them, painting the eastern sky in shades of orange and pink. As they approached hostile territory, the mood in the cockpit shifted. The world outside the canopy was no longer friendly. "All right, Valkyrie," Gadget said, his voice all business. "We're 30 miles out from their radar coverage. Time to go to work." Ava's fingers flew across her console, bringing the primary jammer online now. A low hum filled the cockpit as the powerful electronics pods came to life. On her screen, she could see the enemy's search radar signals, represented as green lines, suddenly turned to static. They were blind now, an electronic fog of war rolling ahead of them. "We're in," Jester's voice crackled over the secure channel. "Good work, Growler. Keep them blind for us." They flew deeper into the mountains, a winding maze of stone and shadow. The target was in a deep valley, a perfect place to hide a missile battery. Jester, Miller, and Davis peeled off, dropping down into the canyons to begin their search, while Eva and Gadget circled at a higher altitude, their electronic umbrella protecting the fighters below. "I'm picking up something new," Eva said suddenly, her eyes narrowing at her screen. "A different kind of signal. It's faint, and it's mobile." "What is it?" Gadget asked. "Not sure. It's not a standard search radar. It's more like a targeting radar, but it's hopping frequencies so fast it's hard to get a lock on. It's very advanced." She reported it to Jester. "Jester, this is Valkyrie. Be advised, I'm seeing a mobile targeting radar in your vicinity. Recommend you alter your search pattern." There was a pause, and then Jester's voice came back, dripping with annoyance. "We've got it, Valkyrie. Just keep doing your job and let us do ours. We're not flying on your hunches today." Eva felt a flash of anger. He was dismissing her again, treating her warning like the ramblings of an amateur. "Gadget, he's ignoring me," she said on their private intercom. "I know," Gadget replied, his voice tight. "Stay on it. See if you can get a better fix on that signal." Eva worked furiously, trying to isolate the strange, jumping signal. It was like trying to catch a fly in the dark with a pair of chopsticks. But then, she saw it. For a fraction of a second, the signal stabilized, and its source appeared. On her map, it wasn't in the valley with the suspected SAM site. It was on the ridge above it, and it wasn't alone. She saw other faint signals pop up around it. It wasn't a single mobile radar. It was an ambush. "Jester, it's a trap." She screamed into the radio. "The SAMs aren't in the valley. They're on the ridges. They've boxed you in. Get out of there now." But it was too late. As if her words were a cue, the sky erupted. From hidden positions on the surrounding cliffs, missiles streaked into the air on pillars of white smoke. On her screen, Eva watched in horror as multiple enemy fighters, which had been hiding in the radar clutter, suddenly appeared, diving down on Jester's trapped formation. "Mayday! Mayday! We're engaged. SAMs and bandits everywhere," Miller shouted, his voice high with panic. The radio dissolved into a chaos of frantic calls and alarms. Eva could only listen, her heart pounding in her chest, a cold, sickening dread washing over her. She and Gadget were too high, too far away to help. All they could do was watch the tragedy unfold on their screens. She saw Miller's signal disappear from her display, followed a moment later by Davis's 2 F-16s, 2 pilots, gone in an instant. "Jester, what's your status?" Gadget yelled into the radio. "Talk to me." Jester's voice came back, strained and breathless. "I'm hit. My engine's on fire. I'm trying to get out." Eva watched his signal, a single blue icon, desperately trying to climb out of the valley of death. But he had 2 enemy fighters on his tail. He wasn't going to make it. "We have to go help him," Eva said to Gadget. "We go down there, we die too," Gadget said, his knuckles white as he gripped the control stick. "Our job is to jam, not fight." But then, something happened that Eva didn't expect. Jester managed to get a lucky shot. One of the fighters on his tail exploded in a ball of fire. He had a chance, a slim one, but a chance. He just needed to shake the last one. "Gadget, he's almost clear," Eva urged, and then she heard the words that would haunt her forever. It was on the command channel, for everyone to hear. It was Jester. "My controls are shot. I can't shake him. I'm punching out." Eva watched his icon on her screen. It stopped climbing. It didn't turn or evade. It just stopped. And then, a second icon appeared beside it, the small, lonely symbol of an ejection seat. "We have a chute. Jester is out of the plane," Gadget reported, his voice grim. But Eva was staring at her data screen, at the telemetry from Jester's jet, and what she saw made her blood run cold. His controls weren't shot. His engine was damaged. Yes, but his control surfaces, his rudder, his ailerons, they were still responding. He could have kept fighting. He could have tried to escape. He hadn't been shot down, he had given up. In a moment of pure cowardice, he had abandoned his multi-million-dollar jet and left his team to die, just to save his own skin. As his empty F-16 plunged into a canyon wall, the last enemy fighter, its job done, turned its attention to the only remaining American aircraft in the sky, their Growler, incoming. Gadget yelled, as an alarm shrieked through the cockpit. A missile was heading straight for them. Gadget threw the big jet into a hard dive, pulling impossible G's. Eva felt her body being crushed into the seat. The missile shot past them, missing by a few hundred feet, but the violent maneuver had put immense stress on the airframe. A warning light flashed on Ava's console. Structural damage. "We've got a hydraulic leak in the right wing," she shouted. The jet was shuddering, fighting to stay in the air. The enemy fighter was looping around for another pass. They were slower, less maneuverable, they were a sitting duck. "We're not going to make it," Gadget said, his voice strained as he fought the controls. "I can't hold her steady." Eva looked at the hostile, rocky terrain below. They were deep in enemy territory. If they went down here, they would be captured or killed. Her mind raced, processing the impossible situation. 2 pilots lost. Jester, a coward, on the ground somewhere, and now they were about to be shot down. That it was all because of Jester. His arrogance, his dismissal of her warning, his cowardice. He had led them all into a slaughterhouse. "I'm not getting captured because of him," Eva said, her voice a low, dangerous growl. The enemy fighter was lining up its shot. There was no escape, Eva. "I'm sorry," Gadget said softly. "It's not over yet," she replied. "Get ready to eject on my mark." "What are you talking about?" "Just do it," she commanded, her voice filled with an authority that surprised even herself. She watched the enemy plane grow larger in her display, closer, closer. "Now," she screamed. Gadget didn't hesitate. He pulled the ejection handle. There was a deafening explosion as the canopy blew off, and a violent goo-trenching force as the rocket seats fired, launching them out into the freezing, wind-blasted sky. Their ejection was a brutal, chaotic violence. One moment Eva was in the relative order of the cockpit, the next, she was tumbling through the sky, the wind a roaring monster trying to tear her apart. The force of it knocked the breath from her lungs and blacked out her vision for a terrifying second. Then, with a jarring crack, her parachute deployed, yanking her upright. After the roar of the jet engine and the shriek of the wind, the sudden, profound silence was the most shocking thing of all. The only sounds were the gentle flap of her parachute and the frantic beating of her own heart. Below her, the Growler, their wounded bird, spiraled down, trailing black smoke before disappearing behind a ridge. A moment later, a distant, muffled boom echoed through the canyons. Eva scanned the sky, her eyes desperately searching. A few hundred yards away, she saw another parachute, a splash of white against the endless blue. It was Gadget. He was alive. Relief, sharp and overwhelming, washed over her, but the relief was short-lived. She looked down again, at the hostile world rushing up to meet her. The ground was a brutal landscape of jagged rocks, steep cliffs, and thorny scrub brush. It was a place that didn't care about survival, and somewhere down there were the people who had just shot them down. She hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact as her training had taught her. Her ankles screamed in protest, a sharp, stabbing pain. She ignored it, her adrenaline-fueled mind already working. First things first, get out of the open. She quickly unbuckled her harness, bundling the parachute. A white flag in the middle of the desert was a death sentence. She found a deep crevice between 2 large boulders and shoved the silk inside, covering it with loose rocks. Every instinct screamed at her to find Gadget, but she knew the protocol. They had to stay separated, at least at first. 2 targets were easier to find than 1. They would rendezvous later, at a prearranged rally point, if they could. For now, she was alone, a ghost. She checked her survival vest, a pistol with 2 extra clips, a knife, a first aid kit, a signaling mirror, a compass, and a small, encrypted, emergency radio. It wasn't much to wage a war with, but it was enough to stay alive. She took a moment to check her ankle. It was already swelling, but it seemed to be a bad sprain, not a break. She could still walk, if she was careful. Pain was a luxury she couldn't afford. She pushed it down, packed it away in that same box where she kept her anger and frustration. She had to move. The sun was relentless, and the air was thin at this altitude. She kept to the shadows, moving slowly and deliberately, her eyes constantly scanning the ridges above, her ears straining for the sound of helicopter rotors or the rumble of a truck engine. The world was a symphony of threats, A loose rock could give away her position. A footprint left in the wrong place could lead the enemy right to her. Hours passed. The sun crawled across the sky, and the shadows grew long. Ava's body ached, her ankle throbbed with every step, and a desperate thirst clawed at her throat. But her mind was sharp, honed by years of training and a sheer stubborn refusal to die here. She thought about Jester. She pictured him on the ground, probably already captured, or maybe hiding under a rock, feeling sorry for himself. The man who had called her a liability was the one who had broken, the one who had failed. The irony was so bitter it almost made her laugh. But what had happened to the rest of the team? Miller and Davis were gone, but Jester had ejected. And what about the crew of the convoy he was supposed to be attacking? Were they captured? Her thoughts were cut short by a sound. It was distant, but unmistakable. The growl of an engine. She dropped to the ground, pressing herself flat behind a cluster of thorny bushes. She peered through the leaves, her heart hammering against her ribs. On a dirt track winding through the valley below, a military truck was kicking up a cloud of dust. It was an old, Russian-made model, the kind used by half the world's second-rate armies. As it got closer, she saw 2 soldiers in the cab, and more in the open back. They weren't a search party, they were just a routine patrol, or maybe a transport. They passed her position without slowing down, their voices carrying faintly on the wind. Eva stayed hidden until the sound of the engine faded completely, her body trembling with the aftermath of the adrenaline surge. Seeing the truck sparked an idea in her mind, a desperate, insane flicker of a plan. The enemy was here. They had bases, airfields, they had equipment, and she was a pilot without a plane. As dusk began to settle, painting the mountains in shades of purple and orange, she reached a high ridge that gave her a commanding view of the surrounding area. She pulled out her small pair of binoculars and began to scan the horizon. For an hour she saw nothing but rocks and sand. And then, she found it. It was miles away, nestled in a wide, flat basin, almost perfectly hidden. It was a remote airfield. It was small, probably a forward operating base or a forgotten relic from a past war. She could make out a single, rough runway, a few dilapidated buildings, and a handful of aircraft parked in open-air revetments. They were older models, MiG-29s. By the look of them, a Soviet-era workhorse, a plane she had studied extensively at the academy, a plane she knew inside and out. Theoretically, a new energy surged through her, pushing aside the exhaustion and the pain. It was a crazy idea, a 1-in-a-million shot, but it was better than the alternative, which was to wait here to be captured or to die of thirst. She waited for the cover of complete darkness. The desert night was cold, a stark contrast to the brutal heat of the day. A sliver of moon provided just enough light to see by. She began the long, slow journey down from the ridge toward the enemy airfield that it took her most off night. Every step was a calculated risk. She moved from shadow to shadow, a phantom in the dark. The final half-mile was across open ground, a flat, gravelly plain. She crawled on her belly, the sharp stones digging into her elbows and knees, until she reached the flimsy perimeter fence. It was a simple chain-link fence, topped with a few strands of barbed wire. A joke. She cut through it with the wire cutters on her multi-tool, the snip of the metal sounding like a gunshot in the silent night. She was in the base was quiet. A few lights burned in one of the buildings, probably the barracks or a command post. A lone guard walked a lazy patrol around the perimeter, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. Eva flattened herself in the shadow of a fuel tanker as he passed, so close she could smell the stale tobacco on his uniform. He didn't even glance in her direction. The security was pathetic. They were complacent, overconfident, tucked away in what they thought was their own secure backyard. They never imagined someone would be crazy enough to walk right in. Her target was the farthest revetment, the one deepest in shadow. It held a single MiG-29, looking menacing even at rest. She crept toward it, her senses on fire. This was the most dangerous part. If she was caught now, it was all over. She reached the plane, pressing her hand against its cold, metal skin. It was real. She took a deep breath and circled it, doing a mental pre-flight check. The tires were inflated. The engine cowlings were latched. There were no obvious signs of damage. It was armed, with air-to-air missiles on the wing pylons. Now for the hard part, the cockpit. The canopy was down. She needed to get it open without setting off any alarms. She remembered from her studies that these older MiGs had an external canopy release, a small, recessed lever near the cockpit frame. For ground crews, she ran her fingers along the fuselage, searching in the dark. Her heart leaped when her fingers found it. A small, flush-mounted handle. She pulled. It was stiff, but it moved with a soft click. The heavy canopy unlocked with a quiet hiss of hydraulic pressure. She carefully lifted it just enough to squeeze inside. The cockpit was a foreign country. Unlike the clean, digital glass cockpit of her F-16, this was a cluttered analog world of dials, gauges, and switches. The labels were all in Cyrillic, but the layout, the basic functions, were universal. Throttle on the left, stick on the right, rudder pedals at her feet. The primary flight instruments, attitude, altitude, airspeed, were all in the same basic configuration. She had spent hundreds of hours in a simulator just like this, practicing for this exact, impossible scenario. She took a moment, her mind racing, translating the Russian labels she had memorized years ago. Engine start, fuel pump, battery. This was it, the point of no return. She strapped herself into the unfamiliar seat. The harness felt stiff and rough compared to her own. She took another deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. First, the battery. She flipped the switch. The cockpit came to life with a low hum. Gauges flickered, and a few dim warning lights glowed on the panel. So far, so good. No alarms. Next, the auxiliary power unit, the APU. It was a small, secondary engine used to start. The main ones. She found the switch and engaged it. A low whine started up from somewhere behind her, growing steadily louder. It was a sound that would carry in the quiet night. She was on the clock now. Someone would hear it eventually. She watched the gauges, her eyes darting around the cockpit. APU pressure, good. Fuel flow, good. She put her hand on the throttle levers, pushing them to the start position. Then, she flipped the two engine start switches, one for the left engine, one for the right. The whine of the APU was drowned out by a deep grinding roar as the left engine began to spool up. The whole airframe vibrated. The sound was terrifyingly loud. Any hope of a stealthy getaway was gone. A light flashed on in the barracks. Shouts echoed across the airfield. They knew. Come on, she whispered, her eyes glued to the RPM gauge. The needle climbed agonizingly slowly. 40%, 50%, 60%. She engaged the right engine. The roar deepened, a symphony of raw, uncontrolled power. The guard who had passed her earlier was running toward the plane, shouting and waving his rifle. Other soldiers were pouring out of the barracks. She couldn't wait for a full systems check. She closed the canopy, the heavy glass sealing her into her own little world. She flipped on the navigation lights and a landing taxi light, momentarily, blinding the men running at her. She pushed the throttles forward. The MiG lurched, its powerful engines straining against the brakes. She released them, and the jet shot forward, a lumbering beast coming to life. She steered with the rudder pedals, wrestling the unfamiliar plane down the taxiway and onto the main runway. Figures were scattering in front of her, diving for cover. Someone was shooting at her. She could hear the ping of bullets glancing off the fuselage. She lined up on the center line of the rough runway, pushed the throttles all the way to their stops, and engaged the afterburners. The world exploded behind her. Two massive blue flames erupted from the engines, and the jet leaped forward with a force that slammed her back into her seat. The acceleration was savage, brutal. The runway was too short, littered with debris. The plane was bucking and shaking. A red light flashed on her console, warning she couldn't read but knew was bad. She ignored it. The end of the runway was rushing at her. It was now or never. She pulled back on the stick. For a heart-stopping moment, the plane seemed to resist, its wheels still clinging to the earth. Then, grudgingly, the nose lifted. The shaking stopped. She was airborne. She raised the landing gear and climbed steeply, a ghost in the night, leaving the chaos of the tiny airfield behind. Below her, the base was a whirlwind of confusion, a kicked-over anthill. She was flying. She was free. But her mission was just beginning. She wasn't just escaping. She was going back. She had a team part for Valkyrie's Gambit, the stolen MiG-29 Claude. For altitude, its twin engines roaring a defiant song in the cold night sky. Ava's knuckles were white on the control stick as she wrestled with the unfamiliar aircraft. It was a powerful machine, but crude. It felt less like a surgeon's scalpel, which was how she thought of her F-16, and more like a blacksmith's hammer, heavy, brutal, and unforgiving. Every input had to be deliberate, forceful. Her first priority was to get away from the hornet's nest she had just kicked. She pushed the jet north, toward the desolate, unpopulated mountain ranges, a place where she could think, a place where she could master this beast she now commanded. The cockpit was a chaotic mess of flickering analog gauges and Cyrillic labels. But slowly her training began to take over. Her mind started to translate the foreign symbols into familiar concepts: fuel, altitude, heading, weapons systems. She checked the fuel gauge. It was just over half full. Not great, but workable. Then she turned her attention to the radar. It was a primitive system by her standards, but it worked. She swept the sky around her. It was empty for now. Her next thought was of Gadget and Jester. They were on the ground somewhere in this vast, hostile wilderness. She had her emergency radio, but turning it on would be like sending up a flare. The enemy would be listening for any transmissions. She had to be smart. She remembered the mission briefing. If pilots were shot down, they were to make their way to a series of pre-planned rally points. The primary point was a distinctive, fork-shaped canyon about 50 miles from where they had been ambushed. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot she had. She banked the heavy fighter, turning it back toward the south, toward the danger zone. Flying a stolen enemy jet back into enemy airspace was insane, but leaving her team behind was not an option. As she flew, she experimented with the plane's systems. She figured out how to switch the IFF, the Identify a Friend or Foe system, to broadcast a friendly signal. In this stolen jet, she wasn't an enemy, she was one of them. She was a ghost wearing their uniform. An hour later, as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, she reached the area of the fork-shaped canyon. She flew high, circling like a hawk, her eyes scanning the ground below. It was a desolate, empty landscape. She saw no signs of life. Her heart began to sink. Had she been wrong? Were they already captured? She was about to give up hope when her radio crackled. It wasn't a voice, it was a faint, rhythmic clicking sound. It was on the emergency frequency, the one she had been monitoring. Click, 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 click. It was Morse code, and it was a code she recognized. It was Gadget's call sign. Her hand trembled as she keyed her own radio, sending back a short, simple reply. Click, acknowledged. A voice came over the radio, faint and laced with static, but it was him. Valkyrie, is that you? What in God's name are you flying? Long story, Gadget, she replied, her voice thick with emotion. What's your status? Where's Jester? I'm here. I found him, Gadget said, his voice grim. His leg is broken. He can't walk. We're hiding in a cave on the west wall of the canyon. But Eva, we've got bigger problems. They're not alone. What do you mean? She asked, a cold dread creeping up her spine. The convoy, Gadget explained. The one Jester was supposed to hit. The enemy captured the survivors. They're holding them with us. It's a whole squad of army rangers. They're all here. Eva felt the floor drop out of her world for the second time in as many days. It wasn't just her team anymore. It was a dozen American soldiers. They're being held in the same cave, she asked. No, the enemy has them tied up at the mouth of the canyon. They're using them as bait, Gadget said. They know we're here. They're just waiting for a rescue attempt. Eva, it's a trap. Eva looked down at the canyon. It was a perfect kill box. Any rescue force coming in on the ground would be slaughtered. Any helicopter trying to land would be shot down. And it gets worse, Gadget continued, his voice barely a whisper. The patrol that's guarding them. They have a transport truck. They're not waiting for us to come to them. They're planning on moving the prisoners at sunrise, taking them to a more secure facility. Once that happens, we'll never see them again. Sunrise was minutes away. Ava's mind raced, a whirlwind of desperate calculations. She was one person, in one stolen, unfamiliar jet with limited fuel and a primitive weapons system. Against her was an unknown number of enemy soldiers on the ground, holding a dozen American hostages. The odds weren't just long, they were impossible. But the image of those captured rangers, used as bait, ignited a fire in her. This was Jester's fault. His cowardice had led to this. But she was the one who was here. She was the one with the hammer. All right, Gadget, she said, her voice suddenly calm and clear, filled with a purpose she hadn't felt since this whole nightmare began. I have a plan. It's crazy, but it's all I've got. I need you to do exactly as I say. She laid it out for him, speaking quickly, urgently. She would be the diversion. She would be the chaos. His job, and the job of the senior ranger on the ground, was to get the prisoners ready to move the instant the chaos began. Eva, this is suicide, Gadget protested. You can't take them all on by yourself. Watch me, she said. Now, get ready. It's about to get very loud down there. She ended the transmission and took a deep breath. She looked at the weapons control panel. According to the glowing lights, she had 2 air-to-air missiles, a full cannon, and a rack of unguided rockets, designed for ground attack. have to be enough. She pushed the Miji's nose down, diving toward the canyon. The sun was just beginning to crest the mountains, bathing the scene in a pale morning light. She could see it all now. The transport truck parked at the mouth of the canyon. A group of about 15 enemy soldiers, armed and alert, and huddled together, their hands bound, was the small group of American Rangers. She switched her IFF to broadcast a friendly signal to the enemy on the ground. She was just one of their own, a MiG pilot on a morning patrol. She flew directly over the canyon, waggling her wings in a friendly gesture. She saw a few of the soldiers below look up and wave. They had taken the bait. She continued past the canyon for a few miles, then banked hard, dropping down low, using a ridge to mask her approach. She was coming back, but this time, she wasn't going to be friendly. She armed the rockets. The targeting system was a simple iron sight projected on her windscreen. It was primitive, but it would do. Her target wasn't the soldiers. It wasn't even the truck. It was the canyon wall, just above them. She came in fast and low, a gray blur against the rocks. She was on them before they even heard her coming. She lined up the sight, held her breath, and squeezed the trigger on her control stick. A stream of rockets shot out from under her wings, trailing smoke. They slammed into the cliff face 100 feet above the enemy position. The explosion was deafening. A massive cloud of rock and dust erupted, and a landslide of boulders and scree rained down, not on the soldiers, but directly in front of them, blocking the mouth of the canyon. She had just sealed them in. She pulled up hard, the MiG groaning, in protest, and looped around for another pass. The enemy soldiers were in chaos, scrambling for cover, firing their rifles uselessly into the sky. They had no idea what was happening, why one of their own jets was attacking them. This time, she targeted the truck. She came in even lower, the roar of her engines echoing off the canyon walls. She let loose a burst from her 30mm cannon. The big shells tore through the truck's engine block, which erupted in a cloud of steam and black smoke. The transport wasn't going anywhere. Now for the final, most dangerous part of the plan. She had to give the Rangers a chance to fight back. On her third pass, she flew so low she could see the faces of the enemy soldiers, their expressions a mixture of terror and confusion. She fired another short burst from her cannon, this time, into the ground right next to the largest group of soldiers. The dirt exploded, sending them diving for cover. In that moment of distraction, it happened. Just as she had planned, Gadget and the Ranger NCO, a big sergeant she could see from the air, made their move. They burst from the rocks, knives in hand, and cut the other Rangers free. The soldiers, trained warriors, didn't hesitate. They grabbed the weapons of the guards they had just dispatched. The canyon floor erupted into a firefight. Eva climbed high above the battle, circling a guardian angel in a devil's machine. She watched as the outnumbered but superiorly trained Rangers systematically took control of the situation. She provided air support, making low, menacing passes that kept the enemy soldiers pinned down, unable to organize a proper defense. Every time a group tried to rally, she would send a burst of cannon fire into the rocks near them, keeping them scattered and terrified. It was over in less than 10 minutes. The silence that followed was as loud as the battle itself. Her radio crackled. It was the Ranger Sergeant, his voice full of awe and disbelief. "Ma'am, I don't know who you are or where you came from, but you just saved our lives. The area is secure. We have a few wounded, but we're all alive." "Roger that," Sergeant Eva replied, her voice shaking with the adrenaline come down. "Get your men ready to move. We're not out of this yet." She looked at her fuel gauge. It was flashing red. She had maybe 15 minutes of flight time left. Not enough to get back to friendly territory. Not even close. She had saved them, but she had stranded herself. "Gadget," she said, her voice low, "I'm out of gas. I'm going to have to ditch the plane and join you on the ground." "Copy that, Eva," he said. "We'll find a place to hold up. We'll wait for you." She found a relatively flat mesa a few miles away from the canyon. She brought the MiG in low, fighting the controls as the engines sputtered and died. With no power, the heavy jet dropped like a stone. She aimed for a belly landing, a controlled crash. The impact was bone-jarring. The plane skidded across the rocky ground, shedding parts, screeching and groaning until it finally came to a stop in a cloud of dust, a broken, useless piece of metal. Eva sat in the silent cockpit for a long moment, her body screaming in protest. She had done it. She had bailed out, stolen a plane, and rescued her team. She had gone from sabotage to salvation, but the journey was far from over. She was on foot again, deep in enemy territory, with a dozen rescued soldiers and a long, dangerous rode ahead of them, and back home, just as lives were still waiting for her to rescue.